What do you do when you have almost nothing left and someone with even less shows up at your door asking for help? In the driest years this country ever knew, in a corner of Kansas where the soil had turned to powder and the sky had turned the color of rust, an old farmer was about to answer that question. He didn't know yet that his answer would decide whether he lost everything he had left or found something he never knew he was missing. The year was 1935, and the dust had a way of getting into everything. It settled into the seams of a man's clothes, into the cracks of his hands, into the corners of a house, no matter how many wet cloths you stuffed beneath the doors. Out on the flatlands of western Kansas, the wind didn't just blow, it scoured, stripping the topsoil clean off fields that had once grown wheat tall enough to hide a grown man, and carrying it off in black, choking clouds that turned midday into midnight. Walter Hale had farmed that land for 31 years. He'd buried a wife on the little rise behind the house, raised a son who'd gone off to find work in Wichita and never quite found his way back, and watched neighbor after neighbor pack up their wagons and head west, chasing rumors of California orchards that never seemed to need as many hands as the rumors promised. Walter stayed, not because he was stubborn, though he was, but because leaving felt like admitting the land had beaten him, and Walter Hale had never once, in 60 years of living, admitted a thing like that. His farmhouse was small and weathered, its paint long since sandblasted down to bare wood. In the field beside it stood a scarecrow Walter had built himself years ago, its coat a patchwork of old flour sacks, its head a burlap bag stuffed with straw, a wide-brimmed hat pinned crookedly atop it. Walter talked to that scarecrow some evenings, when the silence of the empty farmhouse grew too heavy to sit inside of alone. It never talked back, but it never argued with him either, which Walter figured was more than most folks could say for company. One evening, as a fresh dust storm rolled in low and mean across the horizon, Walter was securing the barn door against the wind when he saw something move near the fence line, small, low to the ground, stumbling. It was a boy, no older than 10 or 11, Walter guessed, though it was hard to tell beneath the layers of dust caked onto his thin frame. His shoes were held together with twine. His jacket, too big for him by half, had clearly once belonged to a grown man. He collapsed against the fence post just as the storm's worst gust came tearing across the field, and Walter, without a second thought, dropped what he was doing and ran to him. He carried the boy inside, laid him by the stove, and spent the better part of an hour coaxing warmth back into him with blankets and broth. When the boy's eyes finally fluttered open, they were sharp, wary, the eyes of a child who had learned the hard way not to trust kindness at first glance. "What's your name, son?" Walter asked, his voice rough but gentle. The boy hesitated a long moment before answering. "Tommy? Just Tommy? That's all you're getting for now." Walter almost smiled at that. There was a stubbornness in the boy that reminded him uncomfortably of the man he saw in the shaving mirror every morning. Over the following days, Walter learned little more than the boy's name, though he learned quite a lot about the boy's character. Tommy rose before dawn without being asked, and worked the chores Walter set him without complaint, mending fences, hauling water, chasing the ever-present dust out of the kitchen, with a broom that seemed to accomplish very little against a battle it could never fully win. He ate sparingly, always waiting until Walter had served himself first, as though half expecting the food to be taken away at any moment. Walter didn't push for answers. He'd learned long ago that some folks tell their stories when they're ready, and not a moment sooner. So instead, he simply let the boy stay in the small room that had once belonged to his own son and the two of them settled, almost without noticing it, into the quiet rhythm of two people learning to trust each other, one chore at a time. It was during the long evenings, mending harnesses by lamplight, that Walter began telling the boy the only kind of wisdom he had to offer. Not sermons, not lectures, just small, plain-spoken truths, worn smooth by a hard life. "Land'll test you," Walter said one night, working a needle through cracked leather. "Storm'll come and take near everything you've built, but it can't take what's inside you, unless you let it. That part's still yours to keep, no matter how bad the wind blows." Tommy said nothing, but Walter noticed the boy's hands had gone still, listening. "Man ought to give what he can when he can," Walter continued. "Don't matter if it's a full plate or a half a one. Somebody somewhere's always got less than you, and somebody somewhere's always got more. Way I see it, that's just life shuffling the deck. No shame in either hand you're dealt, long as you play it honest." Before we go further, I want to ask you something. Have you ever taken in someone with absolutely nothing to offer you back, not knowing whether it would cost you everything you had left? If this story has already got its hooks in you, drop a button in the comments and hit that like button right now, because what Walter is about to discover about this boy is going to change everything you think you understand about this story. Keep watching. 3 weeks after Tommy arrived, a car, a rare enough sight on that dust-choked road that half the county would talk about it for a week, pulled up outside Walter's farmhouse. Out stepped a tall man in a crisp gray suit that looked entirely wrong against the brown, wind-scoured landscape. Harlan Weeks, the president of the Farmers Trust Bank in town, and the man holding the note on Walter's mortgage. Walter's stomach dropped. He'd missed 2 payments already that year, the crops having failed so badly there'd been nothing to sell at market. He stepped out onto the porch, bracing himself for the conversation he'd been dreading for months, the one where a banker in a clean suit explained, politely and regretfully, that the land his family had worked for 3 decades no longer belonged to him. But Harlan Weeks wasn't looking at Walter. He was looking past him, at the boy standing in the doorway, dust still clinging to the hem of his oversized jacket. "Thomas," the banker said, his voice cracking with something that sounded almost like disbelief. "Thomas, thank God." It turned out that Thomas Harlan Weeks, Jr., had run away from his family's home in town nearly a month earlier, after overhearing his father discuss, over dinner, the long list of farms the bank intended to foreclose on that season, Walter Hale's name near the top of it. The boy, in a fit of childish fury and guilt he didn't fully understand himself, had decided he wanted no part of a house built on other people's ruin, and had walked out into the dust with nothing but the clothes on his back, determined to see for himself exactly what his father's decisions cost the families on the other end of them. He had chosen Walter's farm at random. He hadn't known, when he collapsed against that fence post, that he'd stumbled onto the very man his father was preparing to put out of his home. Harlan Weeks stood frozen on the porch, taking in the sight of his son, thinner, sunburned, dressed in someone else's spare coat, looking healthier and more at peace than he had in months of comfortable meals back home. "He's been eating half of what I eat," Walter said quietly, "and working twice as hard as any boy his size ought to. Never once complained, never once asked for a thing he didn't earn first." Harlan looked at his son for a long moment, something shifting visibly behind his eyes. Then he looked at Walter, really looked, perhaps for the first time seeing not a name on a list of overdue accounts, but a man who had taken in a stranger's child with nothing to gain from it and asked for nothing in return. Harlan Weeks stayed for supper that night, at his son's quiet insistence, and ate the same simple meal of beans and cornbread that Walter and Tommy had been sharing for weeks. He said little during the meal, but he watched everything. The easy, unhurried way Walter spoke to the boy, the small dignities the old farmer extended, even with so little left to extend, the scarecrow standing sentinel in the darkening field outside the window, patched together from whatever scraps a hard life had left lying around, and still standing tall despite it. When the meal was finished, Harlan Weeks pulled a folded document from his coat pocket, the very mortgage note that had been due to seal Walter's fate, and set it on the table between them. "I came out here today to deliver a foreclosure notice," he admitted quietly. "I've delivered 11 of them this month alone." I told myself it was simply business. Numbers on a ledger. I never once thought to ask what any of those farms looked like from the inside, or who might be feeding a stranger's child at the same table where I was about to take everything away. He tore the document in half. "The bank will extend your note another 2 seasons, Mr. Hale. Interest waived. And if the dust never lets up, and the wheat never comes back the way we're all praying it will," he paused, glancing at his son, who was watching him with an expression Walter couldn't quite name, somewhere between disbelief and pride. "Then we'll find another way. I owe you that much, and a good deal more besides." Tommy stayed 2 more days before returning home with his father, but he came back to visit nearly every weekend after that, learning to mend fences and coax stubborn soil back to life alongside the old farmer who'd taken him in without asking a single question he wasn't ready to answer. And Harlan Weeks, it was said around town, became known in the years that followed as the fairest banker the county had ever had, a man who visited every farm on his ledger in person before making a single decision about its future, and who never again mistook a family's hardship for a simple number on a page. The dust did not let up that year, nor the next. It would be nearly 4 more hard seasons before the rains finally returned to that stretch of Kansas soil. But Walter Hale kept his land, kept his scarecrow standing watch over fields that would one day grow tall and green again, and kept, above all, the quiet lesson he had spent a lifetime trying to live by, and had finally, unknowingly, passed on to a runaway boy who needed to hear it most. Kindness rarely announces its reward in advance. Walter Hale took in a stranger expecting nothing back but the simple decency of doing right by someone in need, and it was precisely because he expected nothing that everything he had left was ultimately saved. We so rarely know, in the moment we choose to give, who exactly we are giving to, or what that small act of generosity might one day return to us tenfold. Perhaps that is exactly why we ought to give anyway, not for what it might bring back to us, but because a stranger standing at your fence post in a storm has never once needed to prove they deserve your help before receiving it. If this story touched something in you, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments, have you ever helped a stranger not knowing what it would cost you, or what it might one day give back? Would you have done what Walter did, taking in a child with no name and no story, simply because he needed a warm place to sleep? Hit that like button if this story reminded you that kindness is never wasted, share it with someone who could use a little hope today, and subscribe, because we'll be back soon with another story about the quiet, everyday heroes this world so easily overlooks. Until next time, be the kind of person a stranger can lean on, even in the middle of your own storm. You never know whose whole future you might be holding up.